Remember when a pound of ground beef, a bag of noodles, and a can of cream soup could feed your entire family for under $2? The 1970s weren't just about bell-bottoms and disco. They were about resourceful cooking that turned economic uncertainty into culinary creativity. While beef prices soared 30% during the early decade recession and gas lines stretched around blocks, American home cooks were quietly performing magic in their kitchens. These recipes weren't just meals. They were survival strategies wrapped in comfort food. From church basement potlucks to weeknight dinner tables across Middle America, these ground beef dishes kept families fed, satisfied, and coming back for seconds. Let's rediscover the forgotten recipes that defined a generation. Porcupine Rice Bake. While porcupine meatballs simmered on the stovetop, their cousin moved the whole concept to the oven for a more hands-off approach. Perfect for working mothers who were becoming increasingly common in 70s America, this casserole required assembly time but no babysitting while it cooked. The principles stayed the same. Uncooked rice mixed directly into ground beef created those characteristic quills poking through the surface. But instead of forming individual meatballs, you'd press the entire mixture into a casserole dish, making assembly faster and easier. The baking liquid was crucial. Tomato soup thinned with water worked perfectly, or if you were feeling fancy, tomato sauce mixed with beef bouillon. The whole thing baked covered for an hour while the rice slowly absorbed liquid and swelled, pushing through the meat layer like an edible pincushion. What made this oven version special was the top surface. Uncovered for the final 15 minutes, it developed a slightly crusty, caramelized layer that added textural contrast. Served with a simple iceberg lettuce salad and some garlic bread, this was the kind of meal that made you look like you had everything together, even when you were juggling 2 jobs and 3 kids. Meatloaf Muffins. Somebody had a brilliant realization during the 70s. Traditional meatloaf took over an hour to bake, but muffin-sized portions would cook in a fraction of that time. Perfect for families racing between soccer practice and Tupperware parties, these individual portions solved the weeknight dinner dilemma. You'd mix ground beef with breadcrumbs soaked in milk, eggs, diced onions, and enough ketchup to make everything slightly sweet. But instead of packing it into a loaf pan, you'd scoop the mixture into greased muffin tins. 25 minutes later, dinner was ready. The genius was in the surface area. Each muffin developed a caramelized crust all the way around, unlike traditional meatloaf that only got crispy on the outside edges. Kids loved them because they felt like personal-sized dinners, special just for them. Mothers loved them because extras could be frozen for emergency meals later. They'd emerge from the oven with their tops glazed in a mixture of ketchup and brown sugar that turned sticky and slightly charred. Serve alongside instant mashed potatoes and canned green beans. This was efficiency eating at its absolute finest. The 70s didn't slow down for anyone, and neither did dinner. Beef stuffed peppers. Stuffed peppers have been around for generations, but the 70s version streamlined everything, making them accessible for weeknight cooking rather than just special occasions. This recipe appeared in every community cookbook from Oregon to Florida, with minor variations reflecting regional preferences but maintaining the same basic architecture. Bell peppers got halved lengthwise, seeds and membranes removed, creating edible boats ready for filling. These got parboiled briefly, so they'd finish cooking in sync with the filling inside. The stuffing mixture combined brown ground beef with cooked rice, usually minute rice for speed, canned tomato sauce, diced onions, and whatever seasonings your family preferred. Italian seasoning packets were popular, or garlic powder and oregano pulled from the spice rack. The pepper halves got stuffed full, arranged upright in a baking dish with a little water in the bottom to create steam. They baked until the peppers turned tender and slightly charred at the edges, the filling bubbling out the top. The final touch was absolutely mandatory. Shredded mozzarella cheese melted across the top during the last 10 minutes. Each pepper became an individual serving, making portion control automatic. They looked elegant enough for company, but were practical enough for family dinner. Nutritionists loved them because vegetables were the actual container, making this one of the healthier 70s options that still satisfied meat and potato sensibilities. Porcupine Meatballs. The name sounds peculiar until you see them cooking. White rice mixed directly into the ground beef would push through the surface during cooking, creating tiny spikes that looked exactly like quills. These became the unofficial mascot of 1970s church potlucks and PDA dinners across the Midwest. Every community gathering featured them, sitting in slow cookers on folding tables covered with vinyl tablecloths. The preparation was straightforward. Ground beef, uncooked white rice, minced onion, and a beaten egg got rolled into spheres about the size of golf balls. They'd nestle into thick tomato sauce made from Campbell's condensed soup because fresh tomatoes cost more than most families could justify. As they simmered, something wonderful happened. The rice absorbed that tomatoey liquid, swelling and pushing through the meat while the meatballs stayed tender and moist. The texture landed somewhere between stuffed peppers and meatloaf, creating something entirely its own. These represented American ingenuity at its finest. Two cheap ingredients transformed into something special enough for Sunday supper. Beef and Macaroni Skillet. Before Hamburger Helper launched in 1971 and became a household name, home cooks were already mixing ground beef with macaroni in cast-iron skillets from coast to coast. This was the original Helper, stretching meat with pasta and improvised sauce. The 70s version became a weeknight staple because everything happened in one pan. Less cleanup meant more time for second jobs or community college night classes. That meat went in first, breaking into crumbles with a wooden spoon scarred from years of use. Garlic powder followed because fresh garlic still seemed exotic in most suburbs. Then came elbow macaroni, beef broth from bouillon cubes dissolved in water, and a generous pour of ketchup or tomato sauce. The real magic happened when everything simmered together. The pasta cooked directly in that beefy liquid, absorbing flavor with every bubble. When the macaroni turned tender, a handful of shredded cheddar went in, melting into stringy, gooey pockets throughout the dish. Simple, quick, and filling. That was the 1970s kitchen promise, delivered in 30 minutes flat. Chipwreck Casserole. Someone looked at ground beef, crushed potato chips, and condensed soup and thought these three things should bake together. The result was polarizing but undeniably popular from Texas clear up to Michigan. The name came straight from church cookbooks, where creative titles mattered almost as much as the recipes themselves. The construction was specific. Brown ground beef mixed with cream of mushroom or cream of chicken soup created the foundation layer. Then came the controversial part. An entire bag of crushed potato chips mixed throughout the casserole and piled on top. Cheese was optional but strongly encouraged, usually the orange pre-shredded kind that came in plastic bags. Into the oven it went, emerging transformed. Those chips on top stayed crunchy and golden, while the ones mixed inside turned into salty, starchy pockets that soaked up the creamy sauce. Every bite was a texture adventure. Crispy, creamy, meaty, absurdly indulgent. Nutritionists definitely weren't invited to 70s potlucks, and Chipwreck Casserole was living proof. This represented an era when processed foods weren't considered the enemy. They were the exciting future of American cooking, and people embraced them without apology. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes. This Depression-era holdover found new life when the 1970s recession hit hard. Beef prices jumped 30% seemingly overnight, and families from Portland to Pittsburgh needed answers. The solution came in a cast-iron skillet where a single pound of ground beef could stretch to feed 6 hungry people. You'd get that meat browning first, breaking it into small crumbles until it rendered its fat. Then came the magic. Flour stirred directly into those drippings created a roux that turned golden and nutty. Milk went in slowly, transforming the whole thing into thick, peppery gravy studded with beef. Spooned over a mountain of mashed potatoes, this wasn't fancy. It was survival that somehow tasted like love. The gravy would seep into those potatoes, creating pockets of rich, savory comfort that made you forget the electric bill was past due. Today's restaurants charge $15 for deconstructed versions of this, calling it elevated comfort food. The original never needed elevation. It had soul. Tater Tot Casserole. Here's where 1970s convenience culture reached its absolute peak. This casserole combined three things Americans couldn't get enough of: ground beef, cream of mushroom soup, and those golden frozen potato cylinders that Ida had invented back in 1953. By the 70s, tater tots had become the crown jewel of casserole construction, especially in Minnesota, where they called this whole dish Hotdish. The assembly required almost no skill. Brown your beef with diced onions until everything caramelized together. Spread it across a 9x13 pan. Blanket the whole thing with cream of mushroom soup straight from the can. No mixing required. Then arrange frozen tots across the top in whatever pattern made you happy. 40 minutes at 350 degrees transformed this simple construction into a bubbling masterpiece. The tops of those tots turned golden and crispy, while the creamy, beefy filling underneath stayed molten and rich. Breaking through that crunchy potato crust with your fork into the savory center became the dinner bell sound for an entire generation. This showed up at every church basement funeral reception, every neighborhood potluck, every family gathering. Nobody ever called it fancy. Nobody needed to. It was delicious, and that was enough. Hamburger Biscuit Bake. Here was another marriage of ground beef and refrigerated biscuit dough, but with a completely different personality than the Biscuit Ring. This version layered everything into a casserole dish, creating a complete meal where fluffy biscuits absorbed savory beef juices from below. The 70s absolutely loved this formula. Convenience products elevated through clever assembly. Brown ground beef got mixed with cream of mushroom soup, and maybe some frozen mixed vegetables for color and nutritional virtue. This spread evenly across the bottom of a 9x13 pan. Then came the satisfying part. Those refrigerated biscuits got torn into quarters and arranged across the top like a savory cobbler. Some recipes called for brushing the biscuit pieces with melted butter and sprinkling them with garlic powder, small details that separated good cooks from great ones. As it baked, the biscuits puffed into golden clouds while their bottoms soaked in the creamy beef mixture below. The contrast was absolutely irresistible. Crispy, buttery tops with soft, gravy-soaked undersides. This was comfort food geometry where each element was perfectly positioned to enhance the others. You didn't need culinary school. You just needed to understand how flavors and textures could work together. Old-school goulash or American chop suey. Every Midwestern grandmother had her version of this skillet meal, though calling it goulash would make any Hungarian chef weep into their paprika. This was American chop suey, pure and simple. The one-pot wonder that saved weeknight dinners when mom worked late at her second job. Born in school cafeterias during the post-war years, it exploded across home kitchens when the economy tightened in the 70s. You'd start with ground beef and diced onions in a big skillet, letting everything brown and caramelize until the kitchen smelled like home. Then came elbow macaroni, canned tomatoes, and whatever vegetables were wilting in the crisper drawer. Green peppers if you had them, corn if you didn't, maybe some celery if the garden was producing. Everything cooked together right there in one pan, the pasta soaking up those tomatoey, beefy juices until it turned soft and packed with flavor. The beauty was in its flexibility. Some shredded cheese on top if payday was recent, plain if money was tight. Either way, it bubbled on the stovetop, filling the house with that familiar aroma that meant dinner would be ready soon. This wasn't fine dining. This was survival cooking that somehow tasted exactly like home should taste. Beef and biscuit ring. This recipe looked impressive enough for company, but was secretly easy enough for a Tuesday, making it perfect for the aspirational 70s homemaker. The presentation was pure vintage showmanship. Ground beef baked in the center of a Pillsbury biscuit ring, emerging from the oven looking like something straight from a magazine spread. You'd brown ground beef with onions and your preferred seasonings, maybe adding corn or green beans for color and vegetable points. While that cooled slightly, refrigerated biscuit dough got arranged in a circle on a baking sheet, each piece overlapping slightly to create a connected ring. The beef mixture got spooned into the center hollow. Then you'd fold the biscuit edges over the filling, leaving the middle exposed. 30 minutes at 375 degrees produced a golden, flaky ring with savory beef peeking through. Those biscuits absorbed some of the beef juice, turning tender and flavorful instead of dry. When this hit the table, guests thought you'd spend hours on dinner. The secret of that empty Pillsbury tube in the trash stayed between you and the kitchen. This was a 70s entertaining philosophy in action. Impressive results through convenient shortcuts and absolutely no apologies necessary. Beef and Cabbage Skillet. When grocery budgets got squeezed in the mid-70s, cabbage became the unsung hero of American cooking. At 15 cents per pound, this humble vegetable could transform half a pound of ground beef into dinner for 5 people. Irish and German immigrants had brought cabbage traditions to America generations earlier, but the recession made it mainstream across every background. You'd fire up that avocado-colored electric skillet, the one you got as a wedding gift, and brown your ground beef with onions. Once the meat rendered its fat, thick wedges of cabbage went in, sizzling and wilting in those beef drippings. A splash of Worcestershire sauce, salt, pepper, maybe a can of tomatoes if the budget allowed. The cabbage cooked down into sweet, tender ribbons that absorbed every bit of meaty flavor, transforming from 50 cents worth of vegetables into something that tasted substantial and satisfying. It hit the table steaming hot, usually with buttered white bread on the side for soaking up the juices. Nutritionists today would praise this as a one-pan wonder loaded with vegetables. Back then, people just called it making things work. Beef Jambalaya Bake. The 70s saw Americans experimenting with regional cuisines, though always filtered through a Midwestern sensibility. Beef Jambalaya Bake was what happened when Louisiana's complex rice dish met suburban casserole convenience. That hours-long traditional process got streamlined into a 45-minute bake that captured some Creole spirit, even if purists would call it heresy. You'd brown ground beef with what Cajun cooking calls the Holy Trinity: bell peppers, onions, and celery. Though plenty of recipes suggested dried onion flakes instead of fresh. Canned tomatoes went in along with white rice. And here's where the 70s really showed up. Instead of carefully made stock and measured seasonings, most recipes just called for a packet of Lipton onion soup mix. Everything went into a casserole dish with enough water to cook the rice, then baked covered until the grains turned tender and absorbed all the liquid. The result wasn't authentic New Orleans cooking by any stretch, but it was spicy, hearty, and different enough from the usual rotation to feel adventurous. This represented American food culture's simultaneous curiosity about regional cooking and complete unwillingness to abandon convenience. Served with a side of cornbread from a Jiffy Mix, it brought a taste of Louisiana to kitchens that had never seen the Mississippi River. Mop Prime Rib Patties. The mock trend reached peak aspiration with these patties. When actual prime rib cost a week's worth of grocery budget, home cooks created recipes that captured the essence without the expense. These weren't just hamburgers. They were an attitude, a statement that your family deserved something special even when money was tight. Ground beef got mixed with breadcrumbs, Worcestershire sauce, garlic powder, and the secret ingredient, liquid smoke. That bottled smoke flavor was a 70s kitchen staple, bringing campfire authenticity to suburban stovetops across America. The beef formed into thick patties, then got seared in a hot skillet until crusty and brown. The finish came from a sauce made with condensed mushroom soup thinned with red wine if you had it, or beef broth if you didn't. Presentation mattered enormously. These never appeared on buns but got plated like actual steaks, maybe with roasted potatoes and canned asparagus alongside. When you cut into them, they weren't medium rare like real prime rib, but that charred crust and savory sauce created enough theater to feel genuinely special. These showed up at anniversary dinners, birthday celebrations, any occasion that deserves something beyond everyday cooking. Nobody was fooled into thinking these were actual prime rib. That wasn't the point. These patties represented dignity when budgets couldn't afford luxury. Beef Tamale Pie. Despite the name, this had nothing to do with actual Mexican tamales and everything to do with architectural layering. This was basically shepherd's pie's American cousin, made with ground beef instead of lamb and loaded with corn because Americans put corn in absolutely everything during the 70s. The construction created distinct layers that made each serving look impressive when plated. You'd brown ground beef with onions, add frozen mixed vegetables, or just corn and peas, then bind everything together with beef gravy made from flour, beef bouillon, and the pan drippings. This filling went into a deep pie dish or casserole pan, creating the foundation layer. Then came mashed potatoes, either leftover or instant because nobody judged, spread thick across the top and decorated with forked tines. Those ridges would catch the heat and brown beautifully. A pat of butter on top helped the whole thing turn golden. When it emerged from the oven, that potato layer had transformed into a crust with a fluffy interior, protecting the bubbling, savory filling below. Breaking through that potato roof into the beefy interior was deeply satisfying. The whole thing fed a family of 4 for under $3, making it both an architectural achievement and an economic necessity. Homemade sloppy joes. Yes, Manwich existed in the 70s, making it possible to open a can and call it dinner. But homemade sloppy joes were a point of pride for cooks who refused to surrender completely to convenience culture. This was the recipe passed down from older siblings who remembered eating these in school cafeterias, now recreated at home with more meat and significantly less mystery. The base was straightforward. Brown your ground beef with diced onions and green peppers until everything caramelized together, creating a savory foundation. Then came the sauce, and this was where personal touches mattered. Ketchup as the sweet, tangy base. Brown sugar for extra sweetness. Yellow mustard for tang. Worcestershire sauce for depth. A splash of vinegar to cut through the richness. Some cooks added tomato paste for thickness or hot sauce for kick. The mixture simmered on the stovetop until it reduced to a consistency that was sloppy but not soupy, hence the name that made elementary school kids giggle. Spooned on soft hamburger buns that immediately started disintegrating, these sandwiches were messy by design. You needed napkins, lots of them, to handle the beef mixture dripping down your hands with every bite. Served with potato chips and dill pickles, sloppy joes were weekend lunch perfection. Casual food that brought families together around the table without any fuss or formality. Beef Enchilada Casserole. The 70s discovered Mexican food, or at least an American interpretation of it. Beef Enchilada Casserole was what happened when cooks took enchiladas apart, reassembled them in a casserole dish, and made them manageable for Tuesday night dinner. No individual rolling required, just layers that delivered similar flavors with a fraction of the effort. You'd start by browning ground beef with a packet of taco seasoning, as old El Paso and lorries were fighting for dominance in suburban pantries. Canned enchilada sauce came next, mild enough that kids wouldn't protest. Then the assembly began. Corn tortillas cut into strips created layers, alternating with the beef mixture, canned refried beans, and shredded cheese. Usually cheddar, since authentic Mexican cheeses weren't available in most supermarkets yet. The casserole baked until bubbling and golden, the tortilla strips softening into something between chips and noodles. Topped with sour cream, shredded iceberg lettuce, chopped tomatoes, and sliced black olives from a can, it looked impressive and tasted like family taco night without the assembly line chaos. This represented America's growing interest in ethnic cuisines filtered through convenience culture. Was it authentic Mexican cooking? Not remotely. Did families love it anyway? Absolutely. It brought new flavors to conservative palates while staying safely within comfort zones. Beef and Bean Burrito Bake. Following close behind the Enchilada Casserole came this dish, another deconstructed Mexican concept made Midwest-friendly. The 70s loved burritos as a concept, everything wrapped up in one tortilla, but rolling dozens for a family dinner felt labor-intensive. This casserole delivered burrito flavors in a format that served 8 people from one pan. The filling started with ground beef and taco seasoning, America's gateway to spice, then added canned pinto or refried beans for protein and bulk. The original method actually involved rolling these fillings into flour tortillas and arranging them in a casserole dish. But the lazier version, beloved by working mothers everywhere, just layered everything flat. Tortillas on the bottom, beef and bean mixture, cheese, more tortillas, more filling, topped with enchilada sauce and a final blanket of cheese. The oven transformed this into a lasagna-like structure where the tortillas softened into pasta-like layers. The top got slightly crispy, while everything underneath stayed tender and saucy. Cutting into it revealed those distinct layers, making each serving look like a slice of Tex-Mex cake. It appeared at potlucks, church suppers, and neighborhood gatherings, always disappearing fast. This was cultural exchange through casserole dishes, Americans adapting borrowed flavors into familiar formats that felt safe and delicious. Hamburger Spoonbread Casserole. Spoonbread, that southern specialty somewhere between cornbread and pudding, met ground beef in this unlikely but successful fusion. Southern cooks have been making spoonbread for generations, but pairing it with hamburger meat was pure American casserole innovation. This dish can fuse categories in the best possible way. Was it a main dish with cornbread on top, or cornbread with meat mixed in? The answer was yes to both. You make a cornmeal batter with milk, eggs, butter, and baking powder, creating something pourable rather than firm like regular cornbread. Brown ground beef mixed with sautéed onions and maybe some diced green chilies went into a buttered casserole dish first. Then that cornmeal batter got poured over the top, settling around the meat and creating an almost souffle-like texture as it baked. The result was genuinely spectacular. The spoonbread puffed up, golden and slightly crusty on top, while underneath, the meat and cornbread melted into a spoonable mixture that was part casserole, part cornbread dressing. Southerners recognized their heritage in the spoonbread component, while Midwesterners embraced the familiar casserole format. It was regional fusion before anyone called it that. Beef and potato hash casserole. Breakfast for dinner became increasingly popular during the economically strained 70s, and this casserole brought that concept to its logical conclusion. This was cowboy cooking meets suburban convenience, with ground beef replacing traditional corned beef and frozen hash browns replacing fresh potatoes. Speed was the main selling point. The entire dish went from package to oven in under 10 minutes. You'd combine brown ground beef with thawed hash browns, cream of celery soup, sour cream, and shredded cheddar cheese. Everything mixed together in a casserole dish, then topped with crushed cornflakes mixed with melted butter for that essential crunch factor. An hour in the oven transformed these humble ingredients into a golden, bubbling mass that smelled like Saturday morning and tasted like pure comfort. The hash browns turned creamy inside with crispy edges where they touched the pan. The beef added heartiness, and that cornflake topping provided textural contrast that made every bite interesting. Families served this with fried eggs on top for actual breakfast-dinner fusion, or alone as a complete one-dish meal. It reflected the 70s breakdown of rigid food rules. If something tasted good and saved time, who cared what meal it was technically supposed to be? Sloppy Joe pie. When regular Sloppy Joes weren't fancy enough for Sunday dinner, but the budget couldn't handle a real roast, creative cooks invented this clever hybrid. The dish took familiar sandwich filling flavors and dressed them up with a cornbread topping that made everything feel more special and dinner-worthy. The base started exactly like any good Sloppy Joe. Ground beef browned with onions, then seasoned with ketchup, Worcestershire sauce, and a touch of brown sugar for that sweet, tangy flavor kids couldn't resist. But instead of piling it on hamburger buns, the mixture went into a casserole dish and got topped with cornbread batter made from a box mix or scratch ingredients. As it baked, something magical happened. The cornbread rose and turned golden while absorbing just enough of the beef juices to stay moist and flavorful rather than dry and crumbly. The result looked like a proper dinner that could grace any table, even when unexpected company showed up. Served with a simple salad or canned green beans, this dish could make any family feel like they were dining with style, regardless of what was actually in the bank account. It proved that presentation mattered, and sometimes a little creativity could transform everyday ingredients into something that felt like an occasion. Ketchup-Glazed Meat Patties. Ketchup was more than just a condiment in 70s kitchens. It was a legitimate cooking ingredient that could transform simple ground beef patties into something that tasted like they'd been slow-cooked for hours. The secret was creating a glaze that caramelized during cooking, adding both flavor and visual appeal to an otherwise plain dish. The patties themselves stayed simple. Ground beef mixed with breadcrumbs, egg, and basic seasonings, then formed into individual portions. But the magic happened with the glaze made from ketchup, brown sugar, vinegar, and sometimes a dash of Worcestershire sauce. This mixture got brushed over the patties before cooking and again during the cooking process, building up layers of sweet, tangy flavor that penetrated the meat. As the patties cooked, that glaze caramelized and created a beautiful mahogany coating that made them look expensive and sophisticated despite being made from ingredients that cost almost nothing. The flavor was wonderfully complex, sweet, tangy, and savory all at once. Served with mashed potatoes and green beans, these patties could anchor a meal that felt special enough for Sunday dinner while staying within even the tightest budget. They proved that a little creativity with condiments could elevate the most basic ingredients into something memorable. Beef and Potato Casserole. This classic layered dish reminds you of a time when 40-step recipes from food blogs didn't exist and cooking was all about simplicity and genuine comfort. Layers of brown ground beef, sliced potatoes, and a creamy sauce came together under a generous blanket of cheese, because more cheese always meant more love in Grandma's kitchen. The magic lay in its complete simplicity. Just a few staple ingredients thrown together and baked until bubbly and golden. No fuss, no complicated techniques, just hearty and delicious food. Plus, everything cooked in one pan, which meant less cleanup and more time for other things. The potatoes would soften and absorb all that beefy, creamy flavor, while the cheese on top turned golden and slightly crispy at the edges. Seconds were almost always guaranteed with this dish, making it perfect for stretching the grocery budget and feeding hungry families. This was the kind of meal that appeared on tables across America week after week, never getting old because it delivered exactly what people wanted: comfort, satisfaction, and the taste of home. Salisbury Steak. Before frozen TV dinners turned this into a pale imitation, Salisbury steak was a masterpiece of stretching meat into something genuinely special. Named after Dr. James Salisbury, who believed passionately in the power of beef for good health, this recipe became a staple because it made 1 pound of ground beef look and taste like expensive steaks for the whole family. The trick was in the binding. Breadcrumbs, egg, and a splash of milk transformed ordinary ground beef into substantial individual portions that looked impressive on the plate. Shaped by hand into oval patties, these got pan-fried until golden brown, then set aside while onions cooked down into sweet, caramelized perfection in that same pan. The gravy got built right there using the beef drippings, flour to create a roux, and beef broth that turned into a rich brown sauce, making everything taste like Sunday dinner. Smart home cooks would make extra patties and freeze them for quick meals later in the week when time was even tighter. Children thought they were getting actual steak for dinner, and in a way they were, just not the kind from the butcher's expensive cuts. This was working-class steak, made with equal parts love and necessity. Mop Casserole. The name came from the appearance of noodles mixed throughout, which resembled the strands of an old-fashioned rag mop. This dish became popular because it used broken or leftover pasta, turning what might have been considered waste into the foundation for a hearty family meal. Ground beef got brown with onions and mixed with whatever pasta was available: broken spaghetti, elbow macaroni, or egg noodles that were past their visual prime. Canned tomatoes and tomato sauce created the base, while cream of mushroom soup added richness and helped bind everything together into a cohesive whole. The mixture got seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and whatever herbs were growing in the kitchen garden or sitting in the spice cabinet. Baked until bubbly and topped with cheese if the budget allowed, the casserole was filling, flavorful, and satisfying in a way that made everyone forget it was constructed from leftovers and scraps. The pasta absorbed all those beef and tomato flavors while contributing its own hearty texture. Families could eat this for several meals, and it actually improved with time as the flavors melded together in the refrigerator. This was resourceful cooking that turned potential waste into something delicious and genuinely nourishing. Corn chip beef bake. Sometimes the best recipes came from happy accidents, and this bake was likely born when someone decided to use up a bag of stale corn chips instead of throwing them away. What started as a desperate measure became a family favorite, combining the familiar flavors of tacos with the comfort of a hot casserole. Ground beef got browned and seasoned with whatever Mexican-inspired spices were available: chili powder, cumin, or sometimes just a packet of taco seasoning if the budget allowed. Canned beans, corn, and diced tomatoes stretched the meat and added nutrition without adding much cost. The mixture went into a casserole dish and got topped with crushed corn chips and whatever cheese could be spared from the refrigerator. As it baked, those corn chips created a crunchy topping that contrasted beautifully with the tender beef mixture underneath. The cheese melted and bubbled, creating an irresistible golden layer that made everyone forget this dish was born from using up pantry scraps. Served with a simple salad of iceberg lettuce and tomatoes, it felt like a fiesta even when there was little to celebrate. It proved that sometimes the best kitchen innovations come from making do with what you have rather than following a recipe exactly. Midwest meat pie. Meat pies were traditional comfort food that could stretch a small amount of meat into a meal that felt substantial and satisfying for the whole family. The Midwest version was particularly practical because it used ingredients readily available in farming communities and could be prepared ahead of time for busy families juggling work and home responsibilities. Ground beef got browned with onions and mixed with diced potatoes, carrots, and whatever other vegetables were available from the garden or the crisper drawer. The mixture was seasoned simply with salt, pepper, and maybe some thyme, then placed in a pie crust that was often homemade from flour, shortening, and water. A top crust sealed in all the flavors and created an attractive presentation that made the meal feel special and complete. The finished pie could be cut into wedges that provided neat individual portions, making serving easy and portion control natural. That crust absorbed some of the meat juices while baking, creating a flavorful bottom layer that added to the overall satisfaction. Families could prepare these pies ahead of time and bake them when needed, making dinner preparation more efficient during especially busy periods. This was practical cooking that delivered both nutrition and comfort in every single slice. Beef chili. A good, hearty bowl of beef chili is a classic for a reason that transcends any particular decade. The recipe might have been simple with just ground beef, beans, tomatoes, and chili powder forming the base, but it was always full of deep, satisfying flavor. Chili was a dish that could feed an entire crowd on a minimal budget, and it was absolutely perfect for cold days when you wanted something to warm you from the inside out. The dish has its roots in Texas, where it was originally made without beans at all, but the version most people know today includes beans, which help stretch the meal and add both texture and protein. Every family developed their own take on chili, adjusting the spice level, adding secret ingredients, perfecting the consistency. It was one of those dishes that genuinely tasted even better the next day once all the flavors had a proper chance to meld together in the pot. Chili was and still remains a go-to for parties, family gatherings, and everyday dinners. You could serve it plain in bowls, ladle it over hot dogs, pile it on top of spaghetti Cincinnati style, or use it as a dip with corn chips. Its versatility matched its affordability, making it an enduring favorite that never really went out of style. Hamburger soup. The name might sound strange if you've never encountered it before, but hamburger soup was the ultimate cold weather comfort food. Ground beef, vegetables, and a rich broth all simmered together to create something like having a burger and fries in liquid form, except you didn't need to fire up the grill in freezing weather. The secret to making it taste amazing was letting the ground beef soak up all those savory flavors from the broth, carrots, onions, and celery as everything cooked together. Tossing in a handful of barley or small pasta could bulk it up even more, and a splash of tomato sauce or diced tomatoes added the perfect tangy kick that brought everything together. The leftovers tasted even better the next day after all those flavors had time to meld in the refrigerator overnight. Hamburger soup was a genuinely thrifty way to stretch a single pound of beef into multiple servings, perfect for feeding a crowd on a tight budget. Plus, it was infinitely customizable based on what vegetables you had available or what your family actually liked eating. Some added potatoes, others threw in green beans, and some went wild with cabbage or zucchini. Every pot was different, and every pot was exactly right. These recipes represent more than just dinners from 50 years ago. They represent American resilience, creativity, and the determination to keep families fed and happy regardless of economic circumstances. These dishes came from an era when convenience products were celebrated rather than scorned. when casseroles were the height of dinner sophistication, and when making something delicious from almost nothing was a point of genuine pride. Which of these forgotten recipes do you remember eating at your family table or your grandmother's kitchen? Drop a comment and let us know which one brings back the strongest memories. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next journey through culinary history. We've got decades of forgotten foods still waiting to be rediscovered.